Hi everyone. Good morning and good evening to all the product enthusiasts here. Thank you everyone for joining our first online PCH Salon today. And I'm Depriya. I would be the moderator for the day. So we'll just get started. Today we have with us Clement Kao as our speaker. Clement is a co-founder at Product Manager HQ, a community dedicated to providing career advice for aspiring product managers and experienced product managers. Topic for today at PCH Salon is what should you know about feature parity across platform, and we will discuss what, why, and how of feature parity. So without a further ado, let's welcome our speaker for the day, Clement Kao.
So thank you so much for taking the time to continue to invest in yourself and your professional growth, as well as bonding with your community. I'm really excited to be sharing some of my thoughts in terms of feature parity across platforms. And really what I want to do is first give a quick intro and then really talk about what does it mean to actually tackle a multi-platform product. And what I mean by that is, let's say that you have a product that spans, multiple form factors, iOS, Android, desktop app, web app, right? How do you make sure that all of those features are in sync? And should you actually make sure that they're in sync? I wanted to go ahead and share some of my experiences there because I think when I was first tackling this as a product manager, I didn't really have a clear framework for how to deal with the problem. And so I made a lot of mistakes. And I'm really hoping that by sharing my story with you here today, that you can avoid some of these mistakes as you're tackling your multi-platform products as well. So with that, again, I'm Clement. In terms of my background, I actually started in analytics. So I was an analytics consultant, then I became a product analyst, and from there, I fell into product management on accident. And so I'm currently tackling new business initiatives at Blend, and I am also one of the co-founders as well as a writer at Product Manager HQ. Feel free to reach out anytime on LinkedIn. That is the best place to find me. And for folks to know, I know that some folks in the audience might be new to product management. In case you're looking to get a foothold in, I do have a book on breaking into product management. I discuss a lot about what the day of a life of a product manager looks like, what are the key skill sets, as well as key interview questions to be prepared for. And so, feature parity. So what is feature parity and why does it even matter in the first place? So I think when I first started in product management as basically an associate product manager, I got staffed on a pretty gnarly project. I really needed to deal with a product that spanned across multiple platforms, and it had a lot of rich features. And I didn't really know how to deal with all of them. Like, how do I keep them in sync? How do I know whether to keep them in sync? How to keep my users happy, right? And so what I really want to do is, again, share some of those experiences with you so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel and make all of the mistakes that I made. And so before we go on, just wanted to do a quick poll. Wanted to ask the audience, how many of you have faced challenges in designing product features on multiple platforms? For example, desktop, iOS, Android, web, etc. We currently have a poll on the screen to go ahead and ask that question.
Okay, we have 30 seconds more to go. So please cast your votes. Okay, so here are the results. So 40% of the people say at times. So 50% of them say yes. So Clements, your thoughts on this?
Awesome. So thanks so much for sharing. I think really glad to hear that a lot of you are tackling multiple platforms within your product, right? I think that's one of the ways in which products can be incredibly powerful is by working across multiple platforms, right? But one of the challenges there, which I do want to talk about, is again, how do you make sure that you have consistent user experiences? How do you make sure that your users are engaged with you regardless of what platform that they're on? So really excited to hear that a lot of us have shared kind of the same challenges. And so I think as I talk through my experiences, would love for everyone to reflect on their own experiences and see, would this have helped? Would this have not helped? And kind of funnel that into the Q&A towards the end. And again, for the folks who have not yet done this, I think one of the things that you'll learn as a product manager is as you become more and more senior and as you tackle a larger and larger scope, you'll eventually start tackling products that do span across multiple platforms, right? One of the ways in which to be able to get really great user growth is, let's say that you have a web app. One of the ways in which to increase that user growth is to expand out into mobile, whether that's Android or iOS, as well as the reverse, right? Like maybe you're currently only on Android. Maybe you want to make the jump over to iOS, but that can cause a lot of the problems that I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. So I think this is a really relevant topic for really any product manager, regardless of seniority, because sooner or later we're all going to run into it. And so to talk a little bit about my own experience, so back when I was tackling my product, I was working in real estate. And so I was in charge of a client relationship management app across iOS, Android, and desktop web. And so what did the CRM app actually do? First off, it enabled real estate agents to stay on top of all of their transactions, right? So maybe, I am Agent Clement, and I'm currently working with, 15 different customers, all of them with different needs, right? How do I stay on top of all of that work? The CRM app helped me track, what properties are people looking at, what, how much are people looking to buy for, what types of homes that they're looking at. And so really enabling real estate agents to stay on top of all of that work. We also wanted to make sure that real estate agents could work together in teams. I think one of the things that we learned is that real estate agents aren't lone wolves. They're not, just doing their own business. They're really collaborating with other real estate agents. And so how do we help to empower that through our CRM? As well as, we have a real estate search website for consumers to basically look for homes that they're interested in. And so when they submit a lead to say, hey, I want to go look at this home, we wanted to drive lead conversion by servicing those leads to real estate agents so that they could go ahead and self-select to say, hey, I'm interested in working on this lead. And of course, one of the things that's really crucial for a real estate agent is maintaining an online presence. I think one of the things to keep in mind, especially within the United States, is that a lot of real estate agents are typically much older, right? They might be something like 45 years old, 55 years old, and they don't really have a web presence. And so we wanted to be able to give them that web presence, but also give them control over it so that they could position themselves in the way that best reflected them. And so our CRM app also enabled them to do that. And the final thing was the reason why we made it omnichannel was that, again, speaking to that user persona, real estate agents might be comfortable with different kinds of technology. Some of them might be more technically oriented, and so they might be on Android, right? Or some of them might just want a really easy interface, and so they're on iOS. Or maybe some of them don't even know how to use a mobile phone, and so maybe they're only on the web app. And so we really wanted to make sure that no matter what a real estate agent was using, they would be able to drive their business from the comfort of their own devices. And so that's really why we wanted to make sure that was an omnichannel platform set. And so in terms of how I fit in, so basically I was staffed on this CRM app. And one of the challenges was that all three apps actually had different feature sets and different behaviors. And that caused our real estate agents a lot of confusion, especially when they try to use all of the apps, right? So imagine that you're a real estate agent, right? And you are using our web app, and our web app has the ability to search for a particular customer, right? Like maybe you know that someone's email starts with Bob, but it didn't let you filter by when that transaction came in, right? Whereas on our iOS and Android mobile apps, we didn't have search, but we had filter, right? So that's really confusing. So all of my apps had different behaviors that I had to deal with. And we had a lot of complaints from our real estate agents about how unintuitive our products were, not just on themselves in isolation, but kind of putting all of the products together. Why didn't they work together, right? Like, why are these so inconsistent, and why do they do different things? And on top of that, I wasn't just put in maintenance mode of, hey, Clement, go ahead and make sure that all of these apps work together. I actually had a new business initiative that I needed to drive, which was basically, we wanted to ensure that real estate agents could appropriately work with people who wanted to sell their homes in the United States. And so for some context there, basically in terms of the product that I was working on, for the business model, we were traditionally really good at working with people who are looking to buy homes, right? Imagine that you're a home buyer. The funnel, the set of steps that you take to buy a home are all pretty similar, right? Like you are first going to say, oh, I'm interested in looking for homes of this type. Then you're going to go ahead and schedule an open house to be able to go look at the home in person. And then you're going to want to submit an offer to say, hey, I am willing to pay up to this much to buy a home. And then you're going to go ahead and negotiate over that price, and then you're going to go ahead and secure that home, right? And that leads to a particular CRM flow, right? Basically, we knew that real estate agents would have to meet people, they'd have to talk to people, they'd have to make sure that particular contracts got signed. And so we knew what that conversion flow looked like, but we didn't have a way to do that for home sellers, because for home sellers, their journeys are so different, right? When someone's looking to sell a home, they need to identify, well, okay, in what time frame do I need my home to be sold at? What is the minimum price that I'm willing to sell my home for? How do I make sure that my home is staged really nicely so that I make it look really nice, and then people can come by and basically look at my house, right? And so basically, our existing CRM flow didn't really make sense for our real estate agents to work with home sellers, and I needed to make it work for their home seller business, which made up, again, more than half of their business. So we just really need to make sure that we covered that use case across all of the platforms. So how did I try to tackle this challenge, right? I think there were a couple of approaches that I could have taken, right? I could have said to my executive team, hey, I actually don't think this is a good idea. I think we should go ahead and fix the current products across our platforms because they're not intuitive and we're hearing a lot of complaints. Or I could have said, okay, great, well, I'm just gonna go ahead and ship the thing that I'm supposed to ship and not worry about features not actually working together. But I took a little bit of a hybrid approach, actually. So basically, the way that my team and I thought about this is, well, let's go ahead and as we build out this new functionality to ensure that we can help real estate agents work alongside their home sellers, let's make sure that these all actually interact at parity across the platforms, right? So wherever we could, let's try to keep all of these things in sync with each other, basically to stop the bleeding, right? We didn't want them to diverge any further on iOS and on Android and on web. And so we wanted to really make sure that what we built was the same for all of them. We also wanted to make sure that as we were building it out, that we document any sort of deviations across platforms. Because keep in mind, again, I was new to this product. I didn't actually know what all the deviations could be. And so I wanted to make sure that we tracked them. And then basically after the new functionality went live, then let's go ahead and pay off that product debt, that design debt, that technical debt. Let's really make sure that all of these platforms work together with each other and have feature parity. So that was the way in which we thought about the game plan. And we figured, hey, this is going to make a lot of sense because we'll be able to deliver on the business objective while making sure that the user experience is not as bad as it used to be, and eventually fix the user experience across all of the platforms. So how do we actually tackle this? Well, first, we really wanted to make sure that we got our team organization right. One of the key problems with why all of our features had deviated from one another in terms of each of those platforms was basically each of those teams and each of those platforms in the past was owned by different product stakeholders, and they were owned by different developers. And so what happened was that everyone had their own concept of, oh, well, how is this thing going to work? And everyone made their own decisions in a vacuum. And what that meant was that all of our features no longer worked nicely with each other, right? So again, it's kind of funny to think about, oh, well, why does a particular form factor have the ability to search but not filter? Why did the other ones filter but not search? I think a lot of that was just we were making decisions in vacuums, right? We said, oh, well, this is easier on this platform versus this other platform. We're just going to take the easy way out. And so that's what caused a lot of inconsistency, right? So what we really want to make sure that we did was, there's one product manager who owns the solutions across all of the platforms, and not just one product manager, but one technical owner, right? A solution architect who actually knows how all of the features work across all three front-end apps, right? And then on top of that, we also wanted to make sure that the designs were also consistent because we also knew that the designs didn't make sense as they currently sat. And so we also made sure that there was one designer in charge of the user experience across all three platforms, right? So we had engineering, product design, only one person each across all of the different platforms rather than splitting them up across the platforms to really make sure that whatever we shipped for this new home seller CRM flow, it made sense and it was cohesive, right? But of course, we didn't want to just have one gigantic dev team basically to go do all the work because that can make it really hard to be able to plan and really make sure that all of the teams are running well together. So the way that we did it was we basically split out one dev team per platform. So we had a web team, we had an iOS team, we had an Android team to make sure that the work was parallelized, right? And I think one of the things that I forgot to call out on this slide was we also had only one team in charge of all of the backends, right? So we really want to make sure that whatever functionality we had, we made sure that we created the right backend, we created the right endpoints to make sure that all of these front-end apps could surface that same logic without each front-end app kind of holding all of that business logic. We wanted to make sure that all the backend logic actually went into the backend, kind of rather than having each of these form factors having to deal with all of that business logic. So this is how we organized the team. And in terms of how that actually looked like in real life, right? So I think one of the things I originally really struggled with was, wow, like I have all of these different Jira tickets and I'm not really sure how to track whether people are done or not. And so what I wound up finding most effective for me was basically having a different Jira project for each platform that I was maintaining, right? And so basically what that meant was I had one Jira project for the web version, one for the iOS one, and one for the Android one. And then basically, instead of having a single ticket that said, oh, for this ticket, the definition of done is meet the requirements on web and iOS and Android, I basically duplicated those tickets, right? So basically, I had one ticket for each of the different front ends, one for web, one for iOS, one for Android, for the features where I needed that parity. And then on top of that, I then created what's called a board in Jira, which basically lets you query across different projects so that you can actually see holistically what that looks like across each of the different features. So that's how I actually organized it. But the thing is, of course, you might have a different team structure, right? You might have a different company size. You might have a different scope. And so really, in terms of the key elements that you want to make sure you're tracking against, basically, one, make sure that you know which platform or platforms you're building that feature for. And then you want to make sure that you're measuring the progress against each platform independently, or else you won't ever know the status of, well, did we actually ship this thing? Is it actually done? Is it consistent across the different front-end platforms? And so originally I thought, wow, this is going really great, right? Like, so we shipped the actual, home seller flows. We got a lot of really positive feedback from real estate agents. They said, wow, like this makes a lot more sense. And we started to invest in, clearing out all of those deviations that were originally in the product. Like originally I held a very hardline stance. I said, all of these features have to work the exact same way in web and in iOS and in Android, right? And so what I thought was, oh, in terms of like, for example, a date picker, like they have to look the exact same way across all of the different products, because I don't want my real estate agents, my users, to have to onboard onto all of these different experiences, right? I said, I really need to make sure that I can somehow have the desktop version be able to send push notifications. I really want to make sure that on the mobile, that you were able to do, a lot of really complex functionality. And that just didn't really work. Like all my developers reached out to me saying, Clement, I don't think we can do these things, right? Like we're breaking the way that users will think about these platforms themselves. The form factor doesn't seem like it's going to make a lot of sense. We're not really sure that this is the best way to spend our resources. And originally I resisted until, I got a lot more feedback of, well, real estate agents actually really are looking for, they're not necessarily looking for feature parity as a goal in itself, right? What they really want is they really want an intuitive experience. And feature parity is one way to get to an intuitive experience, but you don't have to have strict feature parity for everything, especially not all the way down to the micro interaction level. So that was a hard lesson for me to learn. And so basically, again, one of the things that I learned the hard way is some form factors are better at doing things than other things. So for example, a desktop, right? So basically, anytime you're working with the web version, that is incredibly powerful if you have a lot of fields to fill out, right? If you have really large text boxes, that is a much easier way to do things. And trying to replicate all of that on trying to replicate all of that on a mobile device is just not really user-friendly, right? So, imagine filling out this really gigantic text box on your mobile phone. It's just not really user-friendly, and it doesn't, real estate agents don't really need that. They just typically think about doing that on their computers. And so I learned the hard way of, okay, well, there are some things that desktop is good at doing that, mobile is not good at doing, and I shouldn't have feature parity for those things on mobile. And I also learned it the hard way for the reverse. So the thing is, mobile is really, really good at doing push notifications, right? So kind of all of your native iOS apps, your native Android apps, they are able to send out these push notifications in a really intuitive way for users to act on. But when you are on desktop web and when you're bound by the browser that you're using, it's a lot harder to get a user's attention, right? Building out push notifications is not the best use of time in terms of providing a really rich and intuitive experience. And so I learned that one the hard way too, of, well, I can't actually get push notifications to work on desktop. And so I'm going to go ahead and do a quiz now. On your screens, you're going to see a set of options in terms of what is the correct combination of typography for iOS and Android.
I would request all the audience to answer that. Okay. Last 5 seconds or 15. Yeah, 15 seconds to go. Okay, we are done. So Clement, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, for sure. So in terms of the typography on Android, it's Roboto, and on iOS, it's San Francisco. And so why do we bring this up, right? So I think one of the things to keep in mind is that, again, even in between iOS and Android, the two of them actually have very different end users. They have different end user personas, and they have different micro-level interactions. And so one of the things that we have to keep in mind is there are some user paradigms that we shouldn't be breaking, even if it breaks our own features parity, right? And so what do I mean by that? So in terms of how iOS and Android work, by default, iOS doesn't have a back button, right? All the tabs are at the bottom, their tabs are labeled, and when you're trying to pick a date, you have this thing called a scrolling date picker, where basically you scroll up and down. It looks like a little roulette wheel. Whereas for Android, kind of these 4 elements are all really different, right? So on Android, you can always hit back no matter what screen you're on, right? There are tabs at the top of your screen. And then in terms of the tabs, you actually don't want to put labels on them. You actually only want them to have icons. And when you are picking a date with an Android, it actually doesn't give you that roulette wheel. It actually opens up a calendar, right? And again, this is where, as an associate product manager, pretty junior on in my career, I didn't really realize that these were the defaults. I didn't have a really deep sense of this is how the iOS user experience typically works. This is how the Android user experience typically works. And so one of the things that I remember pushing my dev team to do was, hey guys, let's make sure that, on iOS that, we have a back on the screen, just because there is no back button that they can click. And then, also on Android, make sure that there's a back button on the screen. And my developers were really mad at me because they said, well, Clement, Android, there's always a back button. You don't need a back button on the screen. Like, you can use that for better purposes. And I also pushed them, again, to try to unify the user experiences across the two. It just didn't really make a lot of sense, right? And so I think one of the really big lessons that I had to learn the hard way is, there are just some things where if you do it the default way for that mobile platform, it will cost a lot less time for your developers, right? It wasn't just these 4 things that I called out. There are things in terms of, how do you navigate to the next screen? How do you leave the screen? How do you confirm an option? All of these really small micro interactions. Originally, I thought, oh my gosh, all of these things are different from each other, and my user is going to be so confused. And honestly, I was the one who was confused because basically all of these different platforms, these front ends, have their own history and their own context of how users expect to interact with them, right? And so you want to make sure that your users have an intuitive experience. Sometimes that just means that your features are going to be somewhat different from each other across those platforms, and that's completely okay. And so again, there's just times when you can't force parity for everything, and that is completely fine. But then there's a challenge, right? Let's say that there is a deviation, right? Like, let's say that there are some things that work a particular way on Android that work a totally different way on web, right? How do you make sure that you don't lose track of that, right? And again, this can be really valuable for a lot of different reasons. What if you have a new teammate who's joining you, right? What if you have a new developer or a new designer who's joining you? how do you make sure that they understand this nuance? Or when you're communicating out to customers or to executives, how do you make sure that they understand that these deviations were on purpose, right? And so I've found that it's really important to make it explicit that you are making the decision within your tickets, within your documentation, that you want these experiences to deviate from each other, and make sure that your QAs, the people who are testing, also know the difference, so that way, you don't get a bunch of bugs of, oh no, like this looks like it's working differently from the others. That's okay. We want it to work differently from the others, right? And when you do make those decisions, one of the things that I've personally found to be very valuable is to go ahead and put down a date, as well as just a really quick reason as to why you made that decision. And that way you don't second guess yourself later. So I think, I tripped into this problem face first. There were a couple of features where I had made some decision to have them deviate from each other. And basically 3 months down the road, I looked at them and I said, why are these different? I can't really figure out why they're different. And if I'd done myself a favor and logged my decision before of why I decided to make them different, I wouldn't have had to try to figure out what I was thinking back then, right? And then I wouldn't have had to confuse my team or confuse my customers. I would have known right out the gate, oh, well, this is why it's different, of course, right? So, do yourself a favor, make sure that you document your decisions, not just for yourself, but also for your teammates and for your customers, so that way everyone understands, oh, this is the way that the product is supposed to work on this particular form factor. And so what I've really learned is in terms of the general mental model, when it comes to feature parity, right? The thing is, you really want to make sure that at a high level, you have the same kinds of functionality available, right? And so what do I mean by that? I mean, if you're able to search for a particular thing, make sure that you can search by that thing, right? Like if you're able to reassign something to someone else, make sure that you can do that. If you can log out, make sure you can do that. All of these really high level things, you really need to make sure that you incorporate on each of your platforms, because that is a really powerful way to make sure that users have a lot less friction in onboarding onto each of these different platforms, right? They can have a much more seamless experience as they are bouncing in between them, right? That way, it doesn't take as much time for someone to get familiar, and that way, people can feel like they can use the device that best suits their needs, rather than feeling bound to any one device that happens to perform better for their needs. And of course, on top of that, by ensuring that you have this high-level feature parity, that increases your total addressable market, right? It means that there are more types of users who are more likely to use this feature, whatever form factor it's in, whatever front-end platform it's in. And that way you can maximize your impact in driving a behavioral change for the benefit of your users and for the benefit of your business. But when you're dealing with mobile versus desktop, or when you're dealing with interaction design differences, you really want to make sure that you actually do consciously deviate to account for the different capabilities of each of the platforms, right? And so again, on desktop is a lot better for typing out a lot of text, right? It's a lot better for trying to resize a picture. It's a lot better for being able to do a lot of bulk processing. And on mobile is a lot better at doing push notifications, right? Mobile is a lot better at linking out, sharing out to different apps, etc. And so you want to really lean into the strengths of each of these form factors. And on top of that, don't break the user's mental model for how their app should work, right? And so again, apps should work a particular way on iOS. You want to make sure that for your iOS apps that they all look like that, because if your app deviates from that, it's just harder for them to understand, right? Again, really the root problem was I was just not doing a good job in onboarding my users by keeping it intuitive, because I didn't understand that intuitiveness does not equal feature parity. Feature parity is a lever that you can pull to help get to intuitiveness, but sometimes you have to break feature parity to also make sure that your app is intuitive across the broader ecosystem of apps that your users use. And of course, no matter what, please, please, please document your decisions. I cannot stress this enough, how many times I've been burned by someone not documenting their previous decision, and how many times I've burned myself and my teammates for not documenting. So again, if you want to make sure that your feature works the same way across all of your platforms, whether that's a desktop native app, or whether it's a desktop mobile app, or whether it's an iOS app or an Android app or whatever, document that work. Make sure that you're tracking the progress for each one, separately, because the thing is, if you try to bundle all of it together, it can get really, really messy of, okay, well, is it done yet? Is it not done yet? And so you really want to make it clear and granular how your progress is going so that you can keep you and your team accountable for ensuring that those particular features that should be at parity are at parity. And when you do decide to deviate, make sure that you document that it did deviate, why you wanted to deviate, and when you made the decision to have it deviate. Because again, that's just going to save you a lot of second guessing. And it's just one of the problems that comes with owning a product that cuts across multiple platforms. Like, that's just a thing that comes with it. It's both a blessing and a curse. The blessing is that, we get to learn about how all of these different ecosystems work. But the curse is we need to make sure that our product works across all of them. And there's just a lot of complexity there, right? So again, please document your decisions. I think one of the kind of unsung tasks that a product manager does is actually documentation, right? Like, you can feel incredibly unsexy, right? Like, it doesn't feel like you're making decisions necessarily. But when you do document your decisions, it enables your team to move faster. It enables your customers to have experiences that make sense to them. It enables you and your business to run a lot faster. So please document your decisions, especially if you're working across multiple platforms. And with that, Q&A.
Thank you, Clement. Thank you for a wonderful presentation and the insight. I'm sure everyone would be benefited from this. So we would like to go ahead now and take questions from our audience. So requesting everyone to go ahead and type your questions in the chat box to join this discussion. We have our first question already here. So do you suggest creating a separate user journey map for different platform users? So this is the question. Clement, would you like to take it?
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good question. So I would honestly say that, most of the time you actually don't need a different user journey map for each of the different platforms, because the way that I think about it, at least, is that a user journey is something that, has higher level milestones, right? Generally speaking, the user journey should be able to incorporate all of these platforms, because again, for me, I was building a product that needed to work across web and mobile. And so for me, part of that user journey is being able to switch in between them. And so I think if you actually wind up with different user journeys for each of the different form factors and each of the different platforms, you wind up with a very fragmented view of, okay, well, how do these things all work together, right? So I think one of the things that I thought was really valuable in terms of working alongside my designer and my solution architect was mapping out what the onboarding process would look like for a user. Because one of the things that came up is like, oh, well, as they are onboarding to the app and using it for the first time, they really should log into the desktop version so that they can set up their profile picture, so that they can set up their real estate specialties, so that they can set up their geographies, what types of customers they're looking for, etc. But then after that, maybe they're not on desktop so much anymore. Maybe they're on their mobile devices to be able to take their business with them on the go, right? And so I think having a user journey and being able to call out each of the different milestones by the different platforms that you expect to touch it can be valuable, but actually separating it out so that you have one per platform, I think is not a good idea.
Thank you, Clement. I'll take the next question. At what stage should the designer get involved? I felt that some decisions could have been challenged very early on by designers, like overriding component level interaction to be the same across platforms.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think it really depends on the product team's culture, right? So to be totally honest, within that particular organization that I worked in, basically the product manager made a lot of the decisions for the user experience and involved the designer very, very late. And so you raise a really good point. If I had been more collaborative, or if my organization had incentivized me to be a lot more collaborative with my designer, we would have caught all of those problems early, right? But I think the other thing too that happens is, due to the organizational structure, that designer was staffed to many different things. And so they wouldn't have been able to identify those different micro interactions by platform anyways, right? And so I think, there's definitely space where you should definitely reach out to your design team and to your engineering team to make sure that they're giving you input as early as possible. Honestly, one of the big mistakes that I made was not involving them earlier. But on top of that, sometimes you're working within a product organization that doesn't value your cross-functional stakeholders as much, or doesn't give them enough time to do this type of critical thought. And so just keep that in mind, that even though there are things that you yourself can do to try to make it better, sometimes your organization is not set up in a way to really make sure that design is looped in early enough, to make sure that engineering is looped in early enough. And in cases like those, you have to be even more thoughtful and even more proactive in carving out that space to make sure that they do have that voice in the room so that you don't make these really expensive mistakes. So I think that was a really good question. Thank you for asking.
Thank you, Clement. So I'll just go on with the next question. Isn't it better to have different feature across platforms to understand feature adoption, A/B testing, and so forth?
So I think there is a little bit of a conflation there between A/B testing and what features to have, right? And so I think one of the things to consider is, what is the role of A/B testing? The role of A/B testing is to optimize something that you already know, right? And so, for example, if you already know that the way in which your agents or your users are converting leads is generally working, but you want to make fine tunes to the copy, or you want to be able to change the placement of the buttons and see whether that's going to drive an impact, that's where A/B testing makes a lot of sense. But if you're looking at what new feature from my roadmap should I be able to put into my platforms, A/B testing is not the right way to do that, right? You actually want to really understand what is the pain that you're trying to solve and what is your value proposition, what is your hypothesis, before you go ahead and invest all that effort in basically building that out. So I would say that it is okay for you to drive different experiments across all of your different platforms. I agree with that if you know what problem you're trying to solve. But I disagree that you can use A/B testing basically to launch different features across different platforms. And so again, I think one of the things that would not have made sense is if I had actually gone ahead and added all of this profile update capabilities within the mobile apps, because our agents didn't really think of it that way, right? And I could have done that, and I could have A/B tested on it and iterated on it for a very, very long time, and I could have increased engagement on it. But honestly, that wouldn't have been the best use of the mobile app's capabilities. And really, I should just let all of that work on the desktop version, where agents have a lot more flexibility to work with a lot more space on their screens to get all of their profile updates in. So hopefully that answers that question.
Thank you, Clement. Our next question is, where do you track the deviation rationale?
Yeah, great question. So in terms of tracking the rationale behind, in terms of tracking all of that, one of the things that I've found helpful is basically having a decision log that is not part of the spec. And so basically, if you already have a spec that is running, that can already have a lot of complexity in it. And so basically what I did was I had a separate attachment where I basically tracked down all those things. It was just like a lightweight spreadsheet of the very first column was decision, the second column was date, the third column was reason, and it was just pretty straightforward. And again, it really depends on the way in which you and your team work together, right? And so, some teams would prefer to keep their decisions tracked within Jira. Some might prefer to keep it documented within Confluence. Some might prefer to have it documented within email. Really use what works for your organization. But in terms of what worked for me and my organization, again, basically, I linked within the spec at the very top, decision log, here are the places that these deviate, and then basically just had that running list. So then that way you didn't have to always go back and update the master spec of, oh, well, on user story, 1.2.4, for iOS change this, but on Android don't change that, etc., because that would have just created too much noise and too much confusion. So basically I kept that separate from the rest of the spec and the rest of the prompt statement, etc.
Perfect. So we have a few more questions, Clement. The next one is, can you share some insights on MVP for a new mobile app? What could be some pitfalls and how can we avoid them?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that is actually a much broader question in terms of an MVP for a mobile app. So I think first off, in terms of creating an MVP, really the entire point of a minimum viable product is to test whether your value proposition works or not. And you can actually get ahead of that conversation by not even necessarily shipping an app, but actually by doing user interviews with mock screens. And so one of the things that I found to be really effective is basically, pulling together wireframes and sitting in front of users and saying, hey, on this screen, what is it that you would click? Why would you click that? What value do you think that brings you, et cetera? And just really watch them work through something that is much lower fidelity before we even ship anything on mobile, right? And so, it doesn't really matter what form factor you're tackling for your MVP. You generally want to make it as low cost as possible to yield the highest amount of learnings that you can. And so the lowest cost is basically, a conversation with someone. I think one of the challenges of just talking to someone about, oh, I have this mobile app and it would do all of this stuff, is that people can't really visualize it very clearly. And so basically drawing it, even if it's on a piece of paper or if it's on a screen through Balsamiq or whatever wireframing tool you have, having some set of screens where people just pretend to click on some button and then basically tell you how they think about how it will work can yield a lot of insight about how people are thinking about the problem, right? In terms of defaults, I would say honestly, in terms of mobile app interactions, et cetera, I don't necessarily know that an MVP, in terms of trying to identify whether you should even build the functionality or not, or whether you should even ship that app or not. If you're already trying to think through the default behavior, I think you're a little bit too far down into the weeds. You probably want to come a little bit back higher up into what is the user's pain, what are the users that I'm trying to target, what problem am I trying to solve? And then basically drive all of your experimentation at a much lower cost there, rather than trying to actually ship a product and try to think through all of the defaulting behavior from there.
Thank you, Clement. So the next question that we have is, with messaging apps such as Apple Business Chat, Facebook Messenger, emerging as a development platform for platforms, but with significant capability differences. For example, Apple Business Chat offer payment, others don't. Feature parity is governed by what's possible. How do you suggest one should decide the trade-off in such situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think, again, really taking it all the way back up to what does the user's need is the most important part. And so if a user truly, truly does need something that is only available in one version of Facebook Messenger or one version of Apple Business, then make sure that you actually do incorporate that and train your users when they're on the other versions of your app that, hey, this stuff isn't available because that's not supported, right? Whereas if you have found that hey, there's this functionality that only works for one of these form factors, but not for the other ones, I think that can be a really good way to start asking yourself, okay, well, do I actually need this, right? How much is it worth for me to take on this added complexity of supporting it on only one of my platforms and not on my other ones, and basically caring for that and making sure that it doesn't break, that I maintain it, that people are using it, et cetera. And so that honestly comes down to an ROI decision, a return on investment decision of basically how much benefit do you get by supporting out only one out of the many different platforms that you have. If you find that the benefits outweigh the costs, go for it. But if you find that the costs outweigh the benefits, then don't force it, right? Just because you can build it doesn't mean that you should build it. And just because it's not available on all platforms doesn't mean that you shouldn't build it. So it's really on a case-by-case basis of if there's a really deep critical need, then you should probably support it. But if it is a very light user ask, people just request it because they kind of feel like they need it, but you don't really see the impact, then don't invest there.
Okay. Thank you, Clement. So our next question is, as you said, features that require large text boxes do not look user-friendly in mobile view. How can we take a decision on that? When it is important feature for that product, which has to be there in both mobile and web view?
Yeah, for sure. Great question. And so I think one of the things to consider is basically one of the things that I remember doing back when I used to be single is I was actually on dating apps. And basically dating apps have a desktop version as well as an app version. And of course, you have to maintain your profile on both. And they have these really, really big text boxes, right? So I think in those cases, basically it was crucial functionality for you to be able to update your profile on mobile But exactly like you said, you have these really ugly big text boxes that were very unintuitive to navigate. Unfortunately, you're a little bit bound by how that works. Like basically, every time you click into one of these big text boxes, right, like it focuses in, and then you can only type inside that box, and like you leave the box or whatever. And that's just one of the limitations that you have to incorporate. But I don't think it would make sense in that case to tell users, hey, you can only do this on desktop, because that's not where they're expecting to do it, right? And so I think, again, it really comes down to user expectations. What does the user expect to be able to do? And then be able to provide that for them. And again, I think a lot of the times you can learn about user expectations not by actually shipping it, but by actually doing these higher level user interviews where you talk through, hey, this functionality, if it were only on web, would that work for you? Or like, oh, if it were only on mobile, would that work for you? Does it have to be on all of them? Why does it have to be on all of them, etc.? And just knowing that there's going to be some pain in the user experience when you're trying to do something that doesn't really fit that platform really well. So again, kind of for a real estate agent does not need to constantly update their profile. It's really like a set it and forget it type task. And so for them, having it in one place on desktop makes a lot of sense, because that is where they have a lot more powerful capabilities to manage their profile. But on a dating app, where you do need to have it available on iOS and Android and on desktop, you really can't get away without servicing those really giant, ugly text boxes. And a lot of dating apps just have to deal with it, because it is a core use case in terms of the user onboarding. And users are always updating their profiles so that they can attract dates or whatever. And so just because that is the user's need, it just needs to be supported.
Thanks, Clement. I think we are almost at the top of the hour. So I would just ask you one last question here. Is there any framework you follow to maintain feature parity?
Yeah, great question. So I think I alluded to it a little bit earlier, but basically in terms of the framework, at a high level, you want to make sure that general functionality is generally available across all of your platforms. And why is that? You want that to be the case because you want your users to expect that no matter where they go, whether they are on your desktop app or on a browser or on a phone, that they're able to do the same things with their product no matter where they are. But when it comes all the way down to low-level parity, you don't need them to track against each other. It can deviate based on kind of what the user expects there. And so I think, again, it all comes down to what is the user's need, what is the user's expectations at a high level across platforms, across applications. Your users should be able to do the general same set of stuff. But when it comes down to very specific implementation details, like how do you hit back? How do you default? How do you select a default option or not a default option? It doesn't necessarily make sense to have exact interaction parity. So that would be my framework there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Clement.